You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Hello, Nacho Knots. I am glad that you are here today, wherever and whenever you're joining us. I thank you for joining us. And today I want to begin with a quote that sounds a little too simple, but the more that you sit with it, the more it unfolds. On this podcast and in this class, often I talk about one of my favorite mythologists, Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell once said, "Follow your bliss and don't be afraid, and doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be." Now that phrase, "follow your bliss," has become one of those sayings that gets printed on coffee mugs, graduation cards, and inspirational posters. It's one of the reasons that a lot of people know Joseph Campbell's name. And because of this, it can start to feel a little thin, a little shiny, a little too much like just do whatever makes you happy and everything will magically work out. But that's not what Joseph Campbell meant. According to the Joseph Campbell Foundation, Campbell wasn't talking about chasing every passing excitement or running after whatever feels good in the moment. In fact, the foundation explains that Campbell made a clear distinction between shallow fun and something much deeper. He said that if bliss is only fun and excitement, then we're probably on the wrong track. Real bliss, he suggested, requires us to come down into a deeper place inside of ourselves. And Nacho Nuts, I think that matters. Because for a lot of us, especially for those of us who are neurodivergent, burned out, masking, caregiving, surviving, teaching, parenting, working, or just trying to hold life together, follow your bliss can sound almost insulting at first. Like, bliss? Sir, I'm trying to remember if I moved the laundry to the dryer. Bliss? I'm trying to answer 3 emails, find my keys, regulate my nervous system, and not completely fall apart because someone changed the plan at the last minute. Bliss? Some days I'm just trying to follow my grocery list. But that's exactly why I think Campbell's idea is worth revisiting. Because bliss is not the same thing as ease. Bliss is not the same thing as comfort. Bliss is not the same thing as avoiding responsibility. Campbell's idea was closer to this question. What is the thing that keeps calling you back to yourself? Not the thing that impresses other people, not the thing that makes you look successful, not the thing that makes your family comfortable, not the thing that the world told you was practical while slowly training you to abandon your own soul. But the thing that makes, that feels deeply, quietly, and unmistakably alive. The Joseph Campbell Foundation describes bliss as something we discover, not something we simply decide by force. It's not about willing the universe to hand us a perfect life. It's about paying attention, watching ourselves, noticing what we keep returning to, noticing what makes time disappear, noticing where we feel most authentically ourselves. And that, my friends, is where this connects so deeply to neuroaffirmation. Because so many neurodivergent people are taught from a young age to distrust their own enthusiasm. We're told that we're too much, too intense, too focused, too distracted, too sensitive, too emotional, too interested in the wrong things, too passionate about topics other people don't understand. And so we learn to shrink our bliss. We learn to hide it. We learn to call it a special interest in a way that makes it sound childish, instead of recognizing it as one of the sacred pathways back to our own humanity. But what if the thing you were told was too much was actually a clue? What if your deep interest was not a distraction from your life, but a doorway into it? What if your enthusiasm was not embarrassing, What if it was information? What if joy was data? Campbell said we have to learn to recognize our own depth. No one else can tell us what our bliss is going to be. We have to notice the clues for ourselves. And I love that because it gives us a gentler way to think about purpose. Purpose doesn't always arrive with a lightning bolt. Sometimes purpose arrives as the thing you keep reading about at 1 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes it arrives as the conversation you can't stop having. Sometimes it arrives as the art you make when no one is paying you. Other times, it arrives as the person, the community, the cause, the question, or the work that keeps tugging at your sleeve. And sometimes, bliss is not some grand heroic quest. Sometimes bliss is making soup. Sometimes bliss is organizing a room so your nervous system can breathe. Sometimes bliss is teaching one student who finally feels seen. Sometimes bliss is building a community where people no longer have to apologize for existing. Sometimes bliss is realizing that the life you're trying to build doesn't have to look like everyone else's life. Campbell reminds us that following bliss does not mean abandoning wisdom. Later in life, when asked whether people should simply follow love wherever it leads, Campbell said, we have to use our heads too. The head and the heart should not be at war. They should be in cooperation. And that's a very NACHOS message. Because around here, we don't believe in reckless self-abandonment disguised as freedom. We believe in care, in community, in responsibility that doesn't erase the self. We believe in building a life with enough predictability, enough balance, and enough joy that your nervous system can actually hear what your heart has been trying to say. That's PB&J, Nacho Knots. Predictability, balance, joy. Because maybe bliss is not something we chase. Maybe bliss is something we make room to hear. Maybe bliss is what becomes visible when we stop living only in survival mode. Maybe bliss is the quiet voice underneath the noise saying, this way, come back. You're still in there. You're allowed to want a life that feels like yours. So this week, as we begin, I want you to hold this question gently. What keeps calling you back to yourself? And I know I've asked this before, but it's an important question. What keeps calling you back to yourself? Not what makes you feel useful or productive, not what makes you feel impressive, not what makes you easier for other people to understand. What makes you feel alive? What makes time soften? What helps you remember that you're not a machine? Because your joy is not frivolous. Your enthusiasm is not a flaw. Your deep interest is not a problem to solve, and your bliss, when held with care, wisdom, and community, might just be one of the ways your life is trying to find you. And that brings us to something deeper, Nacho Knots, because when we talk about following our bliss, when we talk about joy, purpose, meaning, in the life that calls us back to ourselves, we also have to ask, who gets permission to follow their bliss? Who gets told their passion is genius? And who gets told their passion is weird? Who gets told they're driven? And who gets told they're obsessive? Who gets to get called focused? And then who gets called difficult? Who gets supported in becoming themselves? And who gets disciplined into becoming easier for everyone else? Because our society does not define joy, purpose, success, or productivity in neutral ways. We inherit those definitions. We're trained into them. We're handed scripts about what a good student looks like, what a good worker looks like, what a successful adult, what a normal body, what a calm mind, what a valuable person looks like. And if we don't fit into those scripts, society often tells us that we are the problem. But what if the problem is the script? What if the issue is not that some people are too sensitive, too distracted, too intense, too disabled, too anxious, too loud, too slow, too quiet, or too different? What if the issue is that we build classrooms, workplaces, churches, communities, and systems around one narrow idea of how human beings are supposed to function? This is where universal design becomes so powerful. Universal design asks us to stop treating difference as defect. It asks us to stop building the world for one imaginary average person and then acting surprised when real human beings struggle to fit inside of that average world. Universal design says, maybe the problem is not the person at the bottom of the stairs. Maybe the problem is that we only built stairs. Maybe the problem is not the student who cannot process a lecture at lightning speed. Maybe the problem is that we decided learning only counts when it happens one way, at one pace, in one format. Maybe the problem is not the worker who needs quiet, clarity, predictability, or flexibility. Maybe the problem is we confused unnecessary suffering with professionalism. And Nacho Nuts, this connects right back to bliss. Because people cannot follow their bliss if they're spending all their energy trying to survive systems that were never designed with them in mind. People cannot discover their gifts if they're constantly being punished for the way those gifts arrive. People cannot become fully human in spaces that only reward one version of humanity. So today we're going to look at those definitions. We're going to ask how society defines success, how society defines intelligence, productivity, independence, how society defines normal. And then we're going to ask a better question. What would happen if we design our communities around real people instead of imaginary averages? Because universal design is not just ramps and captions, although those matter deeply. Universal design is a philosophy of belonging. It's a way of saying, let's build the door wide enough before someone has to beg to be let in. It's a way of saying access should not depend on exhaustion. It's a way of saying human beings should not have to prove their pain before we make room for their participation. And perhaps most beautifully, universal design gives more people the chance to hear that quiet inner voice that Campbell was talking about. The voice that says, this is where I feel alive. This is where I can contribute. This is where I belong. This is where my life begins to feel like mine. So let's talk about bliss, but let's also talk about the systems that make bliss possible or impossible. Let's talk about joy, but let's also talk about access. Let's talk about purpose, yes, of course, but let's also talk about design. Because the goal is not just to tell people to follow their bliss. That's the coffee cup stuff. The goal is to help build a world where more people actually can. The goal is not just to tell people to follow their bliss. Again, it's to help build a world where we can all do it. And this is where I want to bring us directly into our Humanities 101 course text. Because the question of who actually gets to follow their bliss is not just a personal question. It's a cultural question. It's a design question. And I dare say it's a humanities question. This semester, as always, We are reading selections from J. Timothy Dolmage's Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education. Again, this book is free and available to everyone, everywhere, both in print and in audio format. And this book helps us look at the systems that shape who gets access, who gets believed, who gets supported, and who gets treated as capable. Dolmage asks us to think carefully about higher education, not just as a place where people learn, but as a place where, a place that often, really, has been built around a narrow idea of intelligence, a narrow idea of communication, independence, productivity, and success. In other words, colleges and universities don't just teach ideas. They teach expectations. They teach us what a good student is supposed to look like. They teach us what participation is supposed to sound like. They teach us how quickly we're supposed to read, write, respond, sit, speak, test, remember, organize, and perform. And if your mind or body or capability doesn't fit those expectations, too often the system tells us that we are the problem. But Dolmage helps us ask a better question. What if the problem isn't the student? What if it's the design? What if the issue is not that someone needs too much support? What if the issue is that support was treated as an exception instead of a basic part of learning? It shouldn't be a revolutionary question. What if the issue is not that someone learns differently? That's a fact. What if the issue is that we built classrooms around one narrow idea of what learning is supposed to look like? That's the heart of this text. Dolmage is not simply saying that individual people can be unfair, although they certainly can be. He's asking us to see how ableism can be built into systems, buildings, policies, traditions, assignments, deadlines, grading practices, classroom layouts, and cultural expectations. And for Humanities 101, and some of y'all's existence as a student, that matters deeply. Because the humanities are not just about memorizing names, dates, books, and artwork. The humanities are about asking what it means to be human. Who counts? Who belongs? Who gets access? Who gets heard? Who gets treated as valuable? Who has to fight just to participate? Now, for this course, you're going to be reading chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 of Academic Ableism. In chapter 1, the author introduces the idea of academic ableism and asks us to notice how higher education has often created barriers for disabled people while pretending those barriers are normal, neutral, or simply unavoidable. In chapter 2, we'll look at more closely at the spaces, structures, and traditions of higher education. Campuses, classrooms, stairways, lecture halls, policies, and institutional rituals all communicate messages about who belong and who have to struggle to get in. In chapter 4, we begin to think more deeply about access and accommodation. And this is where we can start to see the limits of waiting until someone is already excluded and then offering an individual exception. Accommodation matters, but universal design asks us to go further. So in chapter 5, we move towards that possibility. We begin asking what education could look like if disability, difference, and access were not treated as problems to manage, but as starting points for building better classrooms, better institutions, and better communities. So as you read these chapters, I don't want you to think of this as a textbook. I want you to think of this as a lens, as a way of seeing, as a way of noticing the hidden design choices around you. Because once you begin to notice academic ableism, you can also begin to imagine something different. You begin to imagine classrooms where participation doesn't have to look the same for everyone. You can imagine assignments that allow more than one way to show understanding. You can imagine communication that is clearer, kinder, and more predictable. You can imagine learning spaces where access is not an afterthought. You can imagine a world where people are not forced to prove their suffering before they're allowed to belong. And that brings us right back to universal design, because that's at the heart of this text too. Universal design asks us to stop building the world for that imaginary normal person and then patching things afterward when real human beings show up. It asks us to design from the beginning for different minds, different bodies, different communication styles, different sensory needs, different energy levels, and different ways of learning. And Nacho Nuts, that's where Campbell and Dolmage start talking to each other. Because follow your bliss sounds beautiful, but Dolmage helps us ask whether the world is actually built so people can do that. Can a student follow their bliss if a classroom is designed to exhaust them? Can a worker follow their purpose if the workplace punishes them for needing clarity, flexibility, or quiet? Can a disabled person follow a meaningful path if every doorway, deadline, policy, or expectation tells them that they were not imagined in the first place? So this week, as we move from Joseph Campbell and mythology into J. Timothy Dolmage and sociology and disability studies, I want us to hold two questions together. What calls a person towards a meaningful life, and what barriers keep them from reaching it? This is where Humanities 101 lives. Not just in the question of what humans create, but in the deeper questions of what kind of world allows more of us to become fully human. Because joy is not frivolous. Access is not extra. Purpose is not only for the privileged. And design is never neutral. So let's keep asking the bigger question. Not just how do we help people follow their bliss, but how do we build a world where more people finally have that chance? And in many ways, that question is at the heart of your final project for the course. I'm not asking you to redesign the entire world. None of us can do that alone. What I'm asking is something both smaller and in some ways more powerful. I'm asking you to look closely at one space, one process, one experience, or one everyday challenge, and imagine how it could be made more accessible to another human being. Maybe that person is autistic. Maybe that person has a physical disability. Maybe they're an older adult, a parent with a young child, someone learning English, someone struggling with anxiety, or simply someone having a difficult day. Accessibility is rarely about helping only one group. More often, it's about recognizing that human beings experience the world differently and designing with those differences in mind. Your final project is an opportunity to practice this kind of thinking. It's an opportunity to identify a barrier, however small, and propose a practical way to reduce it. Not because you'll solve every problem, and not because you'll create a perfect system, but because every accessible doorway, every clearer instruction, every quieter space, every thoughtful accommodation begins with someone asking, what if this worked better for more people? Real change often starts that way, not with a grand revolution, but with one person noticing a barrier and deciding to do something about it. And once we understand that design is never neutral, we can start to see something even bigger. The world itself is not as fixed as we often imagine it to be. The systems around us can feel permanent. The rules can feel ancient. The expectations can feel like they've always been there. But again and again and again and again, human history reminds us that what we call normal is often just what we've gotten used to. Our classrooms, our workplaces, our ideas about intelligence, our definitions of success, of productivity, even our understanding of the human body and mind are all shaped by the knowledge available to us at any given moment. And as that knowledge changes, so does the world, even if we don't. And that's one of the most beautiful and humbling truths about the humanities. And one of the things I love about being a teacher of the humanities. Human existence is always being revised. New discoveries enter the conversation. New voices challenge old assumptions. New research unsettles what we thought we knew. And sometimes, nacho knots, science comes along and gently, or sometimes not so gently, taps us on the shoulder and says, actually, the universe is stranger than you thought. Your brain is more flexible than you imagined. Human connection matters more than you realize. And the story you inherited may not be the whole story. And that's why curiosity and humility are needed. This is where I find my bliss. So now let's turn to some modern research that might just blow our collective minds. And by modern research, I don't mean telescopes, brain scans, always, or artificial intelligence. Sometimes the research that blows our minds comes from something much older, quieter, and humbler. Sometimes it comes from clay. A recent report from the University of Copenhagen, shared through Science Daily, describes how researchers have analyzed, identified, and digitized a collection of ancient cuneiform tablets held by the National Museum of Denmark. Many of these tablets are more than 4,000 years old, and for decades, they've not been fully studied. But once researchers began decoding them, they found something extraordinary. Texts about magic, about medicine, politics, kinship, bureaucracy, letters between rulers, and yes, even a very old recipe for beer. And Nacho Knots, I love this because on one level, this is archaeology. It's ancient writing. It's the careful work of scholars reading marks pressed into clay thousands of years ago. But on another level, it's a reminder that human beings have always been human beings. We've always been trying to make sense of fear. We've always been trying to organize our community. We've always been trying to track resources. We've always been trying to protect leaders, understand illnesses, communicate across differences and distances, and keep receipts. Sometimes literally. According to the article, the tablets include medical instructions and magical incantations from the ancient Syrian city of Hama. One especially striking tablet contained an anti-witchcraft ritual connected to the royal authority in Assyria. The ritual was meant to ward off misfortune that might affect the king, including political instability. The article explains that this was surprising because such rituals were usually tied closely to Assyrian centers of power, but this tablet was found far from those core regions. Now, I want us to pause here, because it would be easy for modern people to hear magic spells and think, oh, those ancient superstitious fools. But that is too easy. And honestly, it's not very humane. As a humanities approach requires us a better question. What human need was that ritual serving? When a society feels unstable, when power feels fragile, when illness, drought, war, death, or political conflict surround people, human beings create systems of meaning. They create rituals. They create explanations. They create practices that can help them feel like the world can be understood and influenced, maybe even controlled. And before we get too smug about ancient magic, we might want to remember that modern societies also create rituals around fear. We refresh the news, we check the stock market, we watch polling numbers, we track symptoms online, we look for signs that everything will be okay. We may not always burn wax figures while an exorcist chants through the night, but we absolutely still seek patterns, symbols, or practices that help us manage uncertainty. It's not ancient weirdness, it's human vulnerability. The article also notes that the researchers identified a version of a retinal list, a list of rulers, right? That includes mythical and historical kings. One version of this type of list mentions Gilgamesh, the legendary king known from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first story. One researcher quoted in the article says that this makes the list one of those few relics suggesting that Gilgamesh may have been based on a real historical figure. And again, that's a mind blower, because Gilgamesh is not just some ancient name from a dusty textbook. Gilgamesh is part of one of humanity's oldest surviving stories about grief, power, friendship, mortality, and the desperate human longing to escape death. And here we have this reminder that the line between myth and history is not always a wall. Sometimes it's a shoreline. The waves move back and forth. A person becomes a story, a story preserves a memory, and a memory becomes a myth. And 1,000 years later, or more, scholars are still trying to understand where the human beings end and the legends begin. I always think about Bo. Do you know Bo? Bo knows Bo. The last of the legends, apparently. And that's where this is humanity's work here. It's not just asking, did this happen? But asking, why did this story matter so much that people carried it on afterwards? Even if it didn't happen. And then there's my favorite detail, the beer receipt, right? There's nothing that brings ancient history down to earth quite like paperwork. The researchers found that many tablets were administrative records, inventories, personnel lists, financial accounts, goods, labors, and everyday transactions. The article points out that cuneiform was central to managing complex societies, and one tablet recorded something as ordinary as beer. And I want my Humanities 101 students to really hear this. Writing did not begin because someone wanted to post a poem on Instagram. Writing did not begin because someone wanted to write a novel. Writing was bureaucracy. It was accounting. It was labor. It was food. It was beer. It was who owes what. How much grain do you have? Who worked today? Where did goods go? And that matters because it shows us that human culture is not always built out of great monuments and famous kings. It's built out of receipts, recipes, lists, schedules, forms, logs, names, everyday attempts to keep track of life. And maybe that's the biggest connection back to the earlier discussion of design. Because if writing helped build complex societies, then writing can also help build systems. And systems can include people, or they can exclude people. A tablet can preserve a king's name. It can preserve a worker's labor. It can preserve a ritual meant to protect power. It can preserve a beer transaction or recipe. And today, our systems still preserve certain things and erase others. Our institutions still decide what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence, as participation, as intelligence, what gets recorded, what gets ignored, who gets named, who becomes invisible. So when we look at those 4,000-year-old tablets, we're not just looking backwards, we're looking in a mirror. Because these ancient records remind us that human beings have always been meaning makers, system builders, storytellers, record keepers, warriors, WORRIERS, workers, believers, and beer drinkers. And that reminds us that the world as we know it is never complete. There are always hidden treasures waiting to be read. There are always old assumptions waiting to be revised. There are always voices buried in the clay, literally, waiting for someone to notice that they were human too. And that brings us to another ancient human technology. Not clay tablets this time, art. Because if those cuneiform tablets remind us that human beings have always been trying to record, organize, protect, and make meaning out of life, this next article reminds us that meaning itself may be part of what keeps us well. A 2025 report from Trinity College in Dublin shared by Science Daily, summarizes a review of 38 studies involving some 7,000, up to 7, or almost to 7,000 participants. The researchers found that simply viewing visual art can support well-being, especially the kind of well-being connected to meaning, personal growth, and a deeper sense of life having purpose. And here's the beautiful part. These benefits were not limited to museums or fancy galleries. They showed up in hospitals, clinics, virtual reality settings, and everyday encounters with painting, photography, sculptures, installations, graffiti, and other forms of visual art. So let's stay with that for a moment, Nacho Knots, because sometimes we treat art like it's extra. It's a luxury, it's a decoration, it's a nice thing to have after the real work is done. One of those special interests we talked about. But this work suggests that something much more powerful is there. Art may be one of the ways that human beings regulate, reflect, and reconnect with meaning. The researchers even argued that art could be understood as a low-cost, accessible well-being resource, something that healthcare providers and policymakers should take seriously as part of a mental health and public health statistics and strategies. And for Humanities 101, this matters deeply because the humanities are often treated as soft, optional, or impractical. But if looking at art is not just about appreciating beauty, what if it's also about building identity? What if it helps us cope with chaos? What if it helps give us a place to put our grief, our wonder, our fear, our memory, our longing, and our hope? What if art helps us follow our bliss, not because it solves every problem, but because it reminds us that we are more than a problem? That connects us right back to Campbell, connects us back to Dolmage, and it connects us back to that idea of universal design. Because if viewing art can support well-being, then access to art matters. Access to museums, access to visual cultural centers, access to captions, to audio descriptions, to sensory-friendly spaces, to digital access in general, classroom access, public funding for the arts, the design of the experience itself. Because joy is not extra, meaning is not extra, beauty is not extra, and access to those things that help us feel human should not be reserved only for people who already have enough time, money, mobility, energy, or social permission to reach them. So as we move into this article, or as we move from this article, I want to think about how art is not only an escape from the real world, but also one of the ways we survive the real world. Art gives us a place to look, a place to feel, a place to wonder, a place to recognize ourselves, and maybe, just maybe, a place to remember that even in the middle of stress, uncertainty, burnout, and change, human beings are still meaning makers. We're still beauty seekers. We're still creating creatures, or we're still creatures creating and reaching towards connection. So let's talk about art. Let's talk about well-being, and let's talk about why something as simple as looking at an image might help us feel a little more alive. And that leads us beautifully into one more piece of research about where human beings find connection. Because first we talked about ancient tablets and those records and rituals of medicine, labor, and beer. Then we talked about art and how simply looking at visual art can support well-being, reflection, and a deeper sense of purpose. But now we're going to move into something a little bit more modern, or even maybe ordinary, or even surprising. YouTube. Yes, Nacho Not. We have officially gone from ancient clay tablets to museum art to YouTube. And honestly, that's the humanities. Because the humanities are not just about old books and marble statues. The humanities are about how human beings seek meaning, connection, comfort, recognition, and belonging in every age. Sometimes that belonging is IRL, as people say, and sometimes it's digital. but sometimes the method of connection is immaterial to the outcome of the relationship. The 2024 University of Essex study, summarized by Science Daily, found that people often experience one-sided relationships with YouTubers, fictional characters, celebrities, or online personalities as emotionally meaningful. These are called parasocial relationships, and a lot of people have heard this term before. But this means a person feels connected to someone who does not personally know them back. You may be in that situation right here. The study looked at more than 1,000 people, and they found that many participants saw those relationships as emotionally supportive, sometimes even more helpful than casual acquaintances such as neighbors or coworkers. Strong two-way relationships like close friendships or romantic relationships were still rated as the most emotionally fulfilling overall, but parasocial relationships appeared to serve a real emotional function, especially when people needed comfort, validation, and a sense of being understood. And I want us to be careful here, because it would be easy for us to turn it into one of these kids nowadays, or social media, or the TikTok influence. But that would miss the human truth underneath this research. People are not just watching content. People are seeking connection. They're seeking a voice that feels familiar, a face that feels safe, a story that makes them feel less alone, a person who says the thing they needed to hear on a day when no one around them knew how to say it. And for neurodivergent people, disabled people, isolated people, burned out people, caregivers, students, and anyone who has ever felt out of place, this matters. Because sometimes the first place we hear language for our own experience is not from someone in our immediate life. Sometimes it's from a video, a podcast, a creator, a character, a story, a stranger on the internet who somehow says you are not broken at the exact moment we needed to hear those words. And no, it doesn't replace deep friendship. It doesn't replace community. It doesn't replace mutual care. The study itself makes that clear. Close two-way relationships were still viewed as the strongest source of emotional support. But it does remind us that human connection is more complicated than we sometimes like to admit. We're meaning makers. We attach to stories. We attach to voices. We attach to rituals. We attach to the weekly show, the familiar intro, the repeated phrase, the character who understands us, the creator who helps us feel seen. And Nacho Nuts, I cannot help but think about what we're doing here, right here. Because, Nachos is not therapy. It's not a replacement for friendship. It's not a substitute for professional support, but it can be a small place of recognition, a small place of warmth, a small weekly ritual where someone says, you're not a machine. Rest is revolutionary. You're enough. And maybe that's why this research connects so well to everything we've been talking about today. Because all of these stories are really about the same thing. Human beings are always looking for ways to be seen. We press our lives into clay. We paint images onto walls or canvases. We build classrooms and institutions. We write books about access and ableism. We watch videos from people we may never meet. We gather around stories, images, voices, and rituals that help us feel a little more human. So the question is not simply, is online connection real or fake? The better question is, what human need is being met here? And then, how do we design communities where people don't have to be ashamed of needing connection wherever they can find it? Because if a YouTuber, a fictional character, a podcast host, an artist, or an ancient story helps someone feel less alone, maybe we shouldn't mock that. Maybe we should listen to what that longing is telling us. Maybe we should ask why so many people feel unseen in the first place. And maybe we should build a world where every kind of meaningful connection can become a bridge. Not a substitute for belonging, but a pathway towards it. And I want to pause here for a moment, because this article also gives us a way to talk about what happens in spaces like this one. Because yes, research on parasocial relationships can help us understand why a familiar voice, a weekly video, a podcast, a YouTube channel, or a creator might matter to viewers. It helps explain why someone might feel connected to a person they have never met in person. It helps explain why a phrase, a story, a rhythm, or that weekly ritual can become part of someone's emotional landscape. And I don't take that lightly. If NACHOS has ever helped you feel seen, helped you feel less alone, or helped you find language for something you were carrying quietly, well, I'm deeply honored by that. But I also want to be clear about something. It doesn't only go one way. Because while this article helps us think about how viewers can receive connection, comfort, and recognition from creators, I need you to know that the viewers also give something back. You give me hope. You give me strength. You give me perseverance. You remind me many times that this work matters and that it still matters. Every comment, every message, every shared story, every moment where someone says, I needed to hear this today, it becomes part of the fuel that keeps it going, keeps me fired, and keeps me pumping. And I know it may sound sentimental or cheesy, but it's true. Because when you do this kind of work, sitting in a basement alone, when you talk about neuroaffirmation or disability or burnout or humanity, access, self-worth, grief, masculinity, education, community, and all the other things that we talk about, right? In this grand scheme of humanities, you're not just making content. You're trying to build a little shelter in the storm. Building a shelter is tiring. It's vulnerable. It's lonely. And there are days when the world is loud. There are days when the system feels heavy. There are days when the ableism, cruelty, misunderstanding, cynicism, and burnout feel like they are winning. And then one of you shows up. One of you leaves a comment. One of you shares how a phrase helped you talk to a child differently. One of you says that you finally feel understood. One of you tells me that you're trying again. One of you reminds me that kindness is still moving through the world, even when the headlines make it hard to believe. And it changes me, it strengthens me, keeps me going. So yes, maybe a viewer can feel connected to a creator, but a creator can also be deeply moved by the community that gathers around the work. Because you're not numbers to me. You're not analytics or engagement data. You're people. You're people with stories. You're people with nervous systems. People with grief and hope and complicated lives. People trying to love your kids better. People trying to understand yourselves better. People trying to survive institutions that were not always built with you in mind. People trying to make meaning one day at a time. And when you show up here, you remind me that this is not just a broadcast. It's a relationship. Not the same kind of relationship as a close friendship, of course. Not the same as sitting across the table from one another. But it's still something real. It's something human. It's something that matters. Because every time you listen, every time you reflect, every time you take one idea from this space and use it to offer yourself or someone else a little more grace, you become part of the work. You become part of the hope. You become part of the reason I can look at the world with all its heartbreak and all its heaviness and still say, there's good here. There are people trying. There are people healing. There are people building something better. And maybe this is one of the most beautiful things about NACHOS. It's not just me speaking to you. It's us reminding each other that we are still here. We're still worthy. We are still becoming. And we can keep going. So to every Nacho Not who has ever watched, listened, commented, shared, cried, laughed, reflected, or simply sat quietly with an episode when you needed a little company, thank you. Seriously, you give me courage. You give me hope. You give me strength. And you remind me again and again why this work is worth doing. And because of that, I want to offer the gentlest invitation I can. If Nachos has helped you, encouraged you, taught you something, or simply kept you company for a few minutes when the world was heavy, one of the kindest things you can do is help this little community grow. You can like a video, you can share a video, you can follow or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can share with someone who might need a little more grace this week. You can leave a comment, not because the algorithm is sacred, but because your words help other people know they are not alone. And if you're in a place where you're able and willing, you can also support the work of Humanities 101 Foundation through a donation. Every share, every comment, every subscription, every dollar, every moment of encouragement helps us build spaces where people can feel seen, valued, supported, and reminded of their own humanity. So no pressure, no guilt, just gratitude. Because whether you donate, share, comment, listen quietly, or simply carry one idea from this episode into your day or into your life, you're part of this. You're a part of this weird bowl of nachos. You're a part of this community, and I am so glad that you are. So before we go, I also want to lift up something really important that's on the horizon. The Michigan Disability Empowerment Conference, or the MDEC, is coming back to Dearborn in October of 2026. And this matters because this conference is not just an event. It's part of building a future where disabled people are not treated as afterthoughts, burdens, inspirations, or problems to be managed. We're building a future where disabled people are empowered, a future where access is assumed, a future where support is not treated like special treatment, a future where disabled people, neurodivergent people, caregivers, advocates, educators, students, families, workers, and community leaders can come together and say, we belong here. We have wisdom here. We have leadership here, and we are not waiting for permission to help shape the world. And I truly, in my heart of hearts, I truly believe that Dearborn can be one of those places where that future happens. Dearborn has the people. Dearborn has the institutions. Dearborn has the community spirit. And with the right partnerships, the right imagination, and the right commitment to access, Dearborn can become the model for what disability empowerment looks like in Michigan and beyond. So if you're part of an organization, a school, a college, a workplace, or a community group, a business, a public institution that wants to build a more neuro-affirming future, I'd be honored to connect. This is the work I do. I've worked with organizations like Lake Michigan Credit Union, Stop and Shop, and multiple universities to help make their spaces more neuro-affirming. And when I say spaces, I mean that in the fullest sense. Physical spaces, pedagogical spaces, theoretical spaces, workplace spaces, classroom spaces, cultural spaces. Because neuroaffirmation is not just about being nicer to people, though we should absolutely be kinder. It's about design. It's about access. It's about changing the assumptions underneath the room. It's about asking who was imagined when this was built, who was left out, who is exhausted just trying to participate, and what would it look like to create a space where more people can bring their full humanity with them? That's the future we're building. That's the work of the MDEC, the Michigan Disability Empowerment Conference. That's the work of Humanities 101. It's the work of NACHOS. And that's the invitation. If your organization wants to think more deeply about universal design, neuro-affirming practice, accessibility, disability empowerment, inclusive education, or workplace belonging, please reach out. Because we don't have to wait for the future to become more humane. We can build it together. In Dearborn, Michigan, this October is one place where that building continues. So before we close today, I want to take one more gentle breath with you. Because we covered a lot in this episode. We covered a lot. We moved from bliss to access, from ancient tablets to modern art, from online connection to disability empowerment, from personal meaning to public design. And that's a lot to hold. So before we step away from the nacho bowl for the week, let's gather the pieces together. Not as a test, not as a checklist, not as one more thing you have to remember perfectly, but just as a way of honoring our journey that we took today together, because sometimes meaning doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it settles in when we pause, we look back, and we notice the thread that has been holding everything together. So, Nacho Knots, today we started with Joseph Campbell's famous invitation to follow your bliss. But we didn't leave it as a bumper sticker. We asked what bliss really means when life is complicated, when systems are exhausting, and when so many people are taught to shrink their joy, hide their enthusiasm, or mistrust the very things that make them feel alive. We talked about bliss not as shallow happiness, but as the deeper call back to ourselves. The thing that keeps tugging at us, the thing that reminds us that we are still human, the thing that says, this way, come back, there's life over here. And then we ask the bigger question, who actually gets to follow their bliss? Because joy, purpose, and meaning are not just personal questions. They're design questions. They're access questions. They're justice questions. And that brought us into Dolmage's academic ableism in our Humanities 101 course text. We talked about how colleges and universities often define intelligence, participation, productivity, communication, and success in narrow ways. For this course, students will be reading chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5, and those chapters will help us think about academic ableism, access, accommodation, universal design, and what education could become if disability and difference were treated not as problems, but as starting points for better design. Then we widened the lens. We reminded ourselves that the world as we know it is not always the world as it truly is. New discoveries are constantly entering the human conversation. Old assumptions are constantly being challenged, and sometimes the past reaches forward to surprise us. We looked at those ancient cuneiform tablets with records of medicine, magic, rulers, laborers, bureaucracy, and beer, and we remembered that human beings have always been meaning makers, record keepers, workers, believers, warriors, organizers, storytellers, and yes, people who needed beer. Then we moved from clay tablets to art. We discussed research showing that simply viewing visual art can support well-being, especially the kind of well-being connected to meaning, growth, and reflection, i.e. purpose. We reminded ourselves that art is not extra, beauty is not extra, meaning is not extra. Access to all of those things that help us feel human should not be a luxury and definitely shouldn't be treated as such. Then we talked about how online connection and parasocial relationships worked. We explored research showing that people can experience real emotional support from creators, characters, YouTubers, podcasters, and familiar voices, even when those relationships are not two-way and are not close. And we treated that with care. We didn't mock it. We didn't reduce it to screen time. We asked what human need was being met, because sometimes a video, a podcast, a story, or a weekly ritual gives someone the language they need to feel less alone. And then I paused to tell you something important. If Nachos has ever made you feel seen, you needed to know that that goes both ways. You, the viewers, the listeners, the commenters, the quiet watchers, the people who share these episodes and carry these ideas into your homes, classrooms, workplaces, and relationships. You give me hope. You give me strength and perseverance. You remind me that this work matters. You remind me that kindness is still moving. You remind me that people are still trying. You remind me that even in a world full of burnout, ableism, cynicism, and exhaustion, there are still people building something better. And we also talked about how to support that work, not with guilt or with pressure, but with an invitation to like, follow, subscribe, share, comment, and donate if you're able. Help the community grow so that people can find a place where they're reminded that they're not broken, they're not alone, and they're not machines. And then we talked about the Michigan Disability Empowerment Conference that's coming back to Dearborn in October 2026. And even though I'll be in Asia on my lecture tour, I'm still supporting the conference. We talked about how this was building a future where disabled people are empowered, not pitied, where access is assumed, where neurodivergent and disabled people are recognized as leaders, thinkers, creators, workers, students, teachers, and whole human beings. And we talked about how Dearborn, Michigan, is the one place where that future can happen. And we extended invitations to Dearborn and Michigan organizations, schools, workplaces, universities, businesses, and community groups that if they want to be a part of the MDEC or they want to reach out to Humanities 101 for some neuro-affirming work in the future, please do. Because this work can only happen in physical spaces. It can happen in pedagogical spaces, theoretical spaces, workplace, community, classroom spaces. We are ready to come to you. And so if there is one thread running through all of today's episode, it is this. Human beings need meaning. We need access. We need connection. We need beauty. We need stories. And we need systems that make room for our real lives. We need communities that help us remember who we are. And we need a world where more people are actually get the chance to follow the life that is calling them. So remember, maybe the question is not, what is your bliss? Only. Maybe it's also this. What would we need to change so that more people could follow theirs? That's the work. That's the invitation. That's the big old messy bowl of nachos. And as always, I am so deeply glad that you're here. And so now, Nacho Knots, before we move toward the end of our time together, I want us to land gently. Because after all of this, after bliss and access, after academic ableism and universal design, after ancient tablets and visual art, online connection and disability empowerment, we need a moment not just to think, but to receive. We need a moment to let the ideas move from the head into the heart, as Campbell would say. Because it's one thing to talk about meaning. It's a completely different thing to remember that you're allowed to have it. It's one thing to talk about access. It's another thing to believe that you're worthy of it. It's one thing to talk about building a better world, but it's a completely different thing to remember that you don't have to build it while abandoning yourself. So as always, take what serves you and leave what doesn't. Let these words meet you wherever you are today. If all you can do is listen, that's enough. If all you can do is breathe, that's enough. If all you can do is let one sentence be true for one small moment, that's enough. So let's affirm this together. You are not a machine. Your worth is not measured by how much you produce. Your joy is not frivolous. Your bliss is not childish. Your deep interests are not embarrassing. The things that make you feel alive are worth paying attention to. You're allowed to notice what calls you back to yourself. You're allowed to want a life that feels like yours. You're allowed to need support on the way there as well. Access is not special treatment. Support is not weakness. Accommodation is not cheating. Rest is not failure. Needing a different path does not mean you are lost. Needing a different form of design does not mean that you are difficult. You are not broken because a system was not built with you in mind. You are not less intelligent because you learn differently. You are not less valuable because you communicate differently. You are not less human because you move, feel, process, focus, remember, or relate differently. Your body belongs in the room. Your mind belongs in the room. Your voice belongs in the room. And if the room cannot hold you, maybe the room needs to change. You are part of the human story, not just the polished parts, not just the productive parts, not just the easy to measure parts. You are part of the clay tablet. the art gallery, the classroom, the podcast, the community, the conference, the future we are building together. Your story matters. Your presence matters. Your longing for connection matters. Your need for beauty matters. Your hunger for meaning matters. Your desire to be seen, known, and understood is not too much. It's human. And if today has been heavy, may you find one small place of softness. If today has been lonely, may you find one small thread of connection. If today has been overwhelming, may you find one small moment of predictability. If today has been exhausting, may you find one small permission to rest. If today has made you doubt yourself, may you remember that you're still becoming. You don't have to have the whole path figured out to continue walking it. You don't have to follow your bliss perfectly. You don't have to heal on schedule. You don't have to prove your humanity to anyone. You are already human. You are already worthy. You are already enough. And together, little by little, breath by breath, choice by choice, we can keep building a world where more people have the chance to become fully themselves. A world with more access, more joy, more meaning, more softness, more room, more ramps, more captions, more patience, more care, more humanity. So Nacho Knots, as we leave this episode, carry this with you. Your joy is information. Your needs are real. Your access matters. Your story belongs, and you, exactly as you are today, are enough. And with that, my beautiful Nacho Knots, we're going to bring this week's episode to a close. Thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up with your whole humanity, however much of it you had available today. Thank you for thinking with me, wondering with me, laughing with me, learning with me, and building this little corner of care with me. As we move through the rest of the week, I hope you remember this. You're not a machine. Your worth is not your productivity. Rest is revolutionary. Access is love in action. Joy is not extra. And you, exactly as you are today, are enough. So take a breath, drink some water, eat something if your body needs it, move gently if that would help, rest without guilt if you can, and offer yourself the same grace you would so freely offer someone you love. This has been the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for Outreach and Support. I'm Dr. Adam Dutch Hazlett, reminding you that the world gets better when more people are allowed to be fully human. So until next time, Nacho Knots, stay cheesy, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, you're not a machine. Rest is revolutionary, and you are enough.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.